Montana Territory. 1876. The dust had barely settled from the Apache raid when 7-year-old Mercy Whitfield found herself standing before the tallest, most frightening man she'd ever seen. Blood still stained his leather vest, his dark eyes held secrets deeper than canyon shadows, and his silence was more terrifying than any war cry. But desperation makes children brave, and Mercy had nothing left to lose. Her papa was dead. Her mama was broken, and winter was coming fast to the high country. So she looked up at the silent rancher and whispered the words that would change 3 lives forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the burned remains of the Whitfield homestead as Ezekiel Z. Eke Blackwood dismounted his horse. The smell of charred wood and tragedy hung heavy in the September air. He'd seen the smoke from his ranch 10 miles south and had ridden hard through the night. But he was too late. The Apache had struck swift and merciless, leaving destruction in their wake. Zeke was a man of few words and fewer friends. At 32, he'd built his reputation with his fists and his gun, carving out a piece of Montana territory that other men feared to claim. The Blackwood Ranch sprawled across 3,000 acres of some of the most dangerous land in the territory, where outlaws and Indians made life uncertain for anyone foolish enough to try to tame it. But Thomas Whitfield had been different. The quiet farmer had settled upstream from Zeke's spread 2 years ago with his wife Constance and their daughter. Unlike other settlers who came begging for protection or trying to steal his water rights, Whitfield had simply nodded respectfully when they'd met and gone about his business. He'd been a good neighbor, never asking for help but always willing to lend a hand when needed. Now Thomas lay still beside his overturned wagon, 3 arrows buried deep in his chest. His wife Constance sat in the dirt nearby, her blue dress torn and stained, her arms wrapped around their daughter. The woman's eyes stared at nothing, her mind seemingly broken by what she'd witnessed. The little girl Mercy, he remembered, was the only one who seemed truly alive. Her brown hair was matted with dust and tears, but her green eyes burned with a determination that reminded Zeke uncomfortably of himself. At that age, she looked up as his shadow fell across them, and he saw her small body tense like a cornered animal. "Mama won't talk," Mercy said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "She ain't said nothing since they took Papa. I tried to make her drink water, but she just stares." Zeke knelt down, his joints protesting from the hard ride. Up close, he could see that Constance Whitfield was breathing, but her spirit seemed to have fled with her husband's last breath. Her hands trembled constantly, and dried tears streaked her face. "How long ago?" Zeke asked, his voice rough from disuse. "Yesterday morning," Mercy replied. "They came at dawn. Papa tried to fight, but there were too many. They took our horses, and most everything else. She swallowed hard. Then they left." Zeke stood and surveyed the destruction. The house was a skeleton of blackened timbers, but the barn had been spared. A few chickens pecked nervously in the yard, and he could hear a cow lowing somewhere behind the structure. The raiders had taken what they wanted and destroyed the rest, following a pattern he'd seen too many times before. "You got any kin?" he asked, though he suspected the answer. Mercy shook her head. "Papa said we came west to start fresh, said the old life was behind us now." She looked down at her mother's vacant face. "Mama needs a doctor, don't she?" "Nearest doctor's in Willow Creek," Zeke said. 3 days' ride. "We ain't got no horse," Mercy said matter-of-factly. "They took both our mares." Zeke found himself in an uncomfortable position. He'd lived alone for 8 years, ever since he'd left his past behind in Texas. He'd chosen solitude deliberately, knowing that caring for others only led to pain. But looking at this broken family, he couldn't just ride away. "I'll take you to town," he said finally. "Pack what you can carry." Mercy looked around at the ruins of her home. "Ain't much left to pack," she said. She stood and gently tried to pull her mother to her feet. "Come on, Mama. The nice man's gonna help us." Constance allowed herself to be lifted, but moved like a sleepwalker, her eyes never focusing on anything. Zeke watched the little girl struggle with her mother's dead weight, and felt something twist uncomfortably in his chest. He'd seen that look before, in the mirror, the day he'd buried his own family. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, his voice gentler than usual, "we need to go now. Constance turned her head toward him, and for a moment her eyes seemed to clear. "Thomas?" she whispered. Mercy's face crumpled. "No, Mama. Papa's gone. This is Mr. Blackwood. He's gonna help us." The clarity faded from Constance's eyes as quickly as it had come, leaving her staring at nothing again. Zeke lifted her easily and settled her on his horse behind the saddle. Mercy scrambled up behind her mother, her small arms wrapping around the woman's waist to keep her from falling. The ride to Willow Creek took for days instead of 3. Constance had to be helped to eat and drink, as she wandered away from their camps twice during the night, forcing Zeke to track her down in the darkness. Mercy never complained, never cried, just took care of her mother with a dedication that made Zeke's throat tight. On the second night, as they camped beside a small stream, Mercy approached him as he sat staring into the fire. "Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly, "what happens to us in town?" Zeke poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing into the night sky. "Doctor will look at your mama. Preacher might know of folks looking to take you in. What if nobody wants a broke lady and a little girl?" The question hung in the air between them. Zeke had seen enough orphans and widows to know the harsh reality. Without family or resources, their options were limited and grim. "Don't borrow trouble," he said finally. But Mercy was persistent. "You got a wife, Mr. Blackwood." "No. You ever think about getting one?" Zeke looked at her sharply, wondering where this conversation was heading. "No." Mercy was quiet for a long moment, then said, "My mama's real pretty when she ain't sad. And she can cook better than anybody. She makes biscuits that taste like clouds." "Mercy, she ain't always been like this," the little girl continued earnestly. "Before Papa died, she used to sing while she worked. She knew all kinds of songs, and she'd teach me to sew and read from the good book. She's a real good mama." Zeke stood up abruptly. "You should get some sleep." But as he walked away from the fire, he could feel Mercy's eyes on his back, and he knew the seed of an idea had been planted in her young mind. Willow Creek was a rough town that existed mainly to separate cowboys from their wages and miners from their gold. The main street was a collection of saloons, gambling halls, and businesses that catered to men's baser needs. There was a church at one end of town and a cemetery at the other, which seemed fitting to Zeke. Dr. Harrison was a tired man in his 60s who'd seen too much suffering to be surprised by anything. He examined Constance in his small office above the general store while Zeke and Mercy waited outside. "Her body's fine," the doctor said when he emerged. "But her mind, sometimes the spirit just breaks. I've seen it before, especially in women who've lost everything. Some come back from it, some don't." "What can we do?" Mercy asked. "Time," the doctor said, "and prayer. Keep her safe, keep her fed, and hope her mind finds its way home." They took a room at the town's only respectable boarding house, run by a stern woman named Mrs. Fletcher. Zeke paid for a week's lodging and left them there while he went to speak with Reverend Collins about finding a family to take them in. The preacher was a kind man with silver hair and gentle eyes, but his face was grave when Zeke explained the situation. "I wish I could give you good news," Reverend Collins said, "but the truth is, there aren't many families hereabouts with the means to take in a woman and child. And with Mrs. Whitfield in her current state," he shook his head sadly, "most folks have enough troubles of their own." "What about back east?" Zeke asked. "Orphanages." "That would mean separating them," the preacher said, "and the trip alone would cost more than most folks see in a year. I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood. I'll pray on it and ask around, but I can't promise anything." Zeke left the church feeling like he was carrying a weight he couldn't put down. He'd done his duty by bringing them to town, but the thought of leaving them here gnawed at him. Mercy was too young and Constance too broken to survive long in a place like Willow Creek. He found Mercy sitting on the boarding house porch, watching the street. Constance was inside, staring out the window at nothing. "Doctor says Mama might get better," Mercy said without looking at him. "That's good news. But you talked to the preacher, didn't you, about finding us a home?" Zeke sat down heavily in the chair beside her. "He's looking into it." Mercy was quiet for a long time, then said, "You're going back to your ranch tomorrow, ain't you?" "Yes, and we're staying here." It wasn't a question, but Zeke nodded anyway. Mercy drew her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. "I've been thinking," she said quietly, "about what I said by the fire, about you needing a wife." "Mercy, please, let me say this," she interrupted, her voice small but determined. "I know you don't want us. I know we're just trouble you got stuck with. But my mama needs somebody to take care of her, and I need somebody to take care of both of us. And you live all alone on that big ranch. Don't you get lonely?" Zeke felt his chest tighten. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" Mercy turned to look at him, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "Mama's real pretty, and she's good and kind. When she gets better, she'll work hard for you. She'll cook and clean and mend your clothes, and I'll help too. I can gather eggs and feed chickens and learn to do whatever you need." "Mercy, you don't understand." "I understand plenty," she said fiercely. "I understand that we got nowhere else to go. I understand that winter's coming and we'll probably freeze or starve if we stay here. And I understand that you're a good man, even if you pretend you ain't." She stood up and faced him, her small hands clenched into fists. "Please marry my mama, mister. She's all I have now, and I can't take care of her by myself. Please." The words hit Zeke like a physical blow. He saw himself in this desperate child, remembering the day he'd begged strangers to help him bury his own family. The memory was old but still sharp, and it cut through all his carefully built defenses. "Your mama doesn't even know who I am half the time," he said quietly, "but she's still in there." Mercy insisted. "I see her sometimes, in her eyes. She just needs time and somebody to love her back." To herself, Zeke stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out at the dusty street. A part of him wanted to mount his horse and ride away, to return to his solitary life where feelings couldn't hurt him. But another part, a part he'd thought was dead, stirred to life at the sight of this little girl's desperate courage. "It wouldn't be a real marriage," he said finally. "Not at first. Your mama's not. She's not able to consent to such a thing." "I know," Mercy said quietly. "But maybe someday when she's better, and if she never gets better." Mercy was quiet for a long moment. "Then at least she'll be safe, and warm, and fed." "That's more than we got now." That night, Zeke lay awake in his small hotel room, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what he was considering. He'd sworn off attachments 8 years ago, when disease had taken his wife and infant son in Texas. He'd come to Montana to disappear, to live without the risk of loving and losing again. But Mercy's words haunted him. "She's all I have now." He understood that desperation, that fierce need to protect what little family remained. And despite his best efforts to remain detached, he found himself caring what happened to these two broken souls. The next morning, he found Mercy helping her mother eat breakfast in the boarding house dining room. Constance moved mechanically, chewing and swallowing when Mercy guided the spoon to her mouth. But her eyes remained distant. "I've been thinking about what you said," Zeke told Mercy quietly. Hope flared in the girl's eyes, and it wouldn't be easy. "My ranch is isolated, and winters are hard. There's no other women around. No school for you. I can read already," Mercy said eagerly. "Papa taught me, and I ain't afraid of work. And your mama, she might never be the same, I know." Mercy's voice was steady. "But at least we'd be together." Zeke looked at Constance, sitting silently with crumbs on her chin. She was pretty, he supposed, with golden hair and fine features, but it was her brokenness that moved him, the same brokenness he carried inside himself. "All right," he said, finally, "but we do this proper. I'll speak to the preacher about a ceremony, and I'll make it clear to everyone that you're my family now, that anyone who wants to hurt you will answer to me." Mercy's face lit up like sunrise. "Really, you mean it?" "I mean it." Zeke felt something loosen in his chest, like a knot he'd been carrying for years. "Go pack your things. We'll be married this afternoon and head home tomorrow." The wedding was a small, strange affair. Reverend Collins performed the ceremony in his little church, with Dr. Harrison and Mrs. Fletcher as witnesses. Constance stood beside Zeke in her cleanest dress, but her eyes remained vacant throughout the brief service. When asked if she took Zeke as her husband, Mercy had to whisper the answer in her ear, and Constance repeated it without comprehension. Zeke spoke his vows clearly. promising to protect and provide for both Constance and Mercy. As he slipped, a simple gold band on Constance's finger purchased from the general store that morning, he wondered what he was getting himself into. The ride back to the Blackwood Ranch took 2 days. Constance rode behind Zeke on his horse, her arms wrapped loosely around his waist, while Mercy rode the gentle mare he'd bought in town. The little girl chattered nervously, pointing out wildlife and asking questions about the ranch, but Constance remained silent. As they crested the hill that overlooked his spread, Zeke felt an unexpected surge of pride. The ranch house was solid and well-built, with a wide porch and real glass windows. The barn and outbuildings were in good repair, and his cattle dotted the valley like dark specks against the golden grass. "It's beautiful," Mercy breathed. "Is all of this yours, far as you can see in any direction?" Zeke said. "And some you can't." He'd built the house with his own hands, cutting timber from his own mountains and hauling stone from his own creek. It was larger than he'd needed for just himself, but now he was glad for the extra space. The inside was spartanly furnished but clean. There was a large main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a proper stove, and 3 bedrooms. Zeke had lived in just one room, using the others for storage, but now he hastily cleared them out. "You and your mama can have the big bedroom," he told Mercy. "I'll take the small one." Mercy looked around the house with wonder. After their tiny cabin, this seemed like a palace. "It's got real wood floors," she said, running her hands over the smooth planks. Constance moved through the house like a ghost, touching nothing, seeing nothing. Zeke guided her to a chair by the window, and she sat obediently, staring out at the mountains. That first night was awkward. Zeke cooked a simple meal of beans and bacon, while Mercy unpacked their few belongings. Constance ate when food was placed in front of her, but remained silent. After supper, Mercy helped her mother into a nightgown and tucked her into the big bed, then curled up beside her like a protective puppy. Zeke lay awake in his own bed, listening to the house settle around these new occupants. What had he done? He was a rancher, not a nursemaid. He knew nothing about caring for a broken woman and a little girl. But somewhere in the darkness, he heard Mercy humming softly to her mother, and the sound eased something in his chest. The next morning brought their first real test. Zeke woke to the sound of frantic calling and found Mercy searching the house for her mother. "She's gone," Mercy cried. "She was here when I went to sleep, but now she's gone." They found Constance standing in the middle of the pasture in her nightgown, staring at the horizon. Her feet were cut from walking across the rocky ground, and her hair was tangled with burrs. She didn't respond when they called her name. Zeke approached her slowly, as he would have spoken hoarse. "Constance," he said gently, "it's time to come inside." She turned toward him, but didn't seem to see him. "Thomas," she whispered. "Is that you?" "No," Zeke said softly. "It's Zeke. Your husband now. You're safe." He lifted her easily and carried her back to the house, where Mercy fussed over her mother's cut feet and helped her into clean clothes. It was clear that Constance couldn't be left alone, which meant major changes to Zeke's routine. The days that followed established a new pattern. Zeke would rise before dawn to tend the cattle and check his fence lines, always keeping the house in sight. Mercy proved to be remarkably capable for a 7-year-old, helping with cooking and cleaning and watching over her mother with fierce devotion. Constance existed in a world of her own making. Sometimes she would sit quietly for hours. Sometimes she would wander if not watched. Occasionally she would speak, but rarely made sense. Once, Zeke found her in the kitchen trying to make biscuits with dirt instead of flour, her hands moving through the motions of a recipe she remembered but couldn't quite grasp. "She's trying to come back," Mercy said one evening as they watched Constance stare into the fire. "I can tell. Sometimes she looks at me like she almost remembers." Zeke had his doubts, but he kept them to himself. He'd grown fond of Mercy's determined optimism, and he didn't want to crush it. The first real breakthrough came 3 weeks after they'd arrived at the ranch. Zeke was working in the barn when he heard singing a woman's voice, clear and sweet, drifting across the yard. He dropped his tools and walked toward the house, hardly daring to breathe. Constance sat on the front porch with Mercy beside her, braiding the little girl's hair. As she worked, She sang an old hymn, her voice true and beautiful. When she finished, she looked up and saw Zeke, watching from the yard. "Hello," she said simply, as if she was seeing him for the first time. "Hello," he replied carefully. "How are you feeling?" Constance considered the question seriously. Confused, she said finally, "I dream about fire and screaming, but I can't remember why. And sometimes I see a man with kind eyes, but I can't remember his name." "That was Papa," Mercy said softly. "His name was Thomas." Pain flickered across Constance's face. "Thomas," she repeated. "Yes, I think I remember." She looked at Zeke again. "Who are you?" "I'm Zeke Blackwood. I'm your husband now." Constance frowned. "I don't remember marrying you. You were hurt after what happened to Thomas. I married you to keep you and Mercy safe." She absorbed this information slowly. "That was kind of you," she said finally. "But I should warn you, I don't think I'm very good company these days." The moment of clarity lasted only a few hours before. Constance drifted back into her distant world, but it gave them all hope. Over the following weeks, she had more moments of awareness, brief glimpses of the woman she'd been before tragedy broke her. During one of these lucid periods, she asked Zeke about his life before they'd met. He found himself telling her about Texas, about the wife and child he'd lost to yellow fever, about the guilt and grief that had driven him to Montana. "We're quite a pair," Constance said softly, "both of us broken by loss. Maybe that's why we understand each other," Zeke replied. As autumn deepened into winter, their strange little family settled into a rhythm. Mercy proved to be as bright as she was determined, and Zeke began teaching her things Thomas would have taught her: how to ride properly, how to read the weather, how to handle a rifle. She absorbed it all eagerly, hungry for knowledge and attention. Constance's condition continued to improve gradually. She had more good days than bad, and on her good days, she threw herself into keeping house with an energy that seemed to make up for lost time. She cooked elaborate meals, scrubbed floors until they gleamed, and sewed new clothes for herself. "And Mercy, she's trying to earn her keep," Mercy explained to Zeke one evening. "She feels bad about being a burden." "She's not a burden," Zeke said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. Somewhere along the way, he'd stopped thinking of them as obligations and started thinking of them as family. The first snow came early that year, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. Zeke woke one morning to find Constance standing at the kitchen window, fully dressed and lucid. "Good morning," she said without turning around. "The snow is beautiful, isn't it? So clean and peaceful." "Good morning," Zeke replied, joining her at the window. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she said simply, clearer. "Like the snow washed away some of the fog in my head." She turned to look at him. "I remember more now. About Thomas, about what happened, about you saving us." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the snow fall. Then Constance said quietly, "I know this isn't what you wanted, Zeke, a broken woman and someone else's child. But I want you to know that I'm grateful, and I'd like to try to be a real wife to you. If you'll have me." Zeke felt his heart skip. "Constance, I know you loved your first wife," she continued, "and I know I'll never be her. But maybe we can build something good together, something that honors what we've both lost." He turned to face her fully, seeing the strength that had carried her through her darkest days. "I'd like that," he said softly, "more than you know." She smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her face completely. "Then we'll start fresh, today, right now." From that day forward, their marriage began in earnest. It was still a careful courtship, to wounded souls learning to trust again, but it was real. Constance proved to be everything Mercy had promised: kind, hardworking, and possessed of a quiet strength that complemented Zeke's rougher edges. Spring came early that year, and with it came challenges. A neighboring rancher named Fletcher, no relation to the boarding house owner, had been eyeing Zeke's water rights for years. When he learned that Zeke now had a family to protect, he saw an opportunity to press his advantage. Fletcher arrived one morning with 6 men, all armed and looking for trouble. Zeke met them in the yard, his rifle cradled casually in his arms. "Blackwood," Fletcher said, not bothering to dismount, "I hear you got yourself a wife and kid now. That's real nice." Be a shame if something happened to them, you threatening. My family, Fletcher, Zeke's voice was deadly quiet. Just making conversation. Fletcher replied with a cold smile. Thing is, a man with a family has more to lose. Makes him more reasonable. I'm thinking you might want to reconsider my offer for your water rights. Zeke stepped forward, and Fletcher's men shifted nervously in their saddles. Let me make something clear, Zeke said. You come on my land. Again, you threaten my family again, and I'll kill you. Not run you off, not warn you again. I'll kill you. Fletcher's smile faltered. He'd heard stories about Zeke's past, about what he'd done to the last men who'd crossed him. Now see here, get off my land, Zeke said simply. They left, but Zeke knew they'd be back. Men like Fletcher didn't give up easily, and the threat would hang over them like a storm cloud. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Constance asked quietly, Are we in danger? Zeke looked at Mercy, who was pretending to read but was obviously listening. Maybe. He said honestly, Fletcher's been after my water for years. He thinks having a family makes me weak, does it? Constance asked. Zeke considered the question. A year ago, he would have said yes. Now, looking at his wife and the little girl who'd become his daughter in all but blood, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, a reason to fight. No, he said finally, it makes me dangerous. The confrontation came 2 weeks later. Fletcher returned with more men, a dozen this time, and they came at dawn when they thought the family would be sleeping. But Zeke had been expecting them, and he was ready. The fight was brief but vicious. Zeke had the advantage of knowing his own land, and he'd positioned himself in the barn where he could cover the house when the shooting started. Constance and Mercy were safely hidden in the root cellar, as he'd instructed them when the smoke cleared. 3 of Fletcher's men were dead and Fletcher himself was wounded. The rest had fled, and Zeke stood in his dooryard with his rifle smoking in his hands. This ends now, Fletcher, he said quietly. You come after what's mine again, and I'll finish what you started. Fletcher clutched his wounded arm and glared up at him. You can't protect them forever, Blackwood. You got to sleep sometime. Then I guess you better kill me clean, Zeke replied, because if you don't, I'll hunt you down like the dog you are. Fletcher left that day and never returned. Word spread quickly through the territory that Zeke Blackwood would kill to protect his family, and that was enough to keep other threats at bay. That night, as Constance tended a cut on Zeke's cheek, she said softly, I was wrong about you being dangerous because of us. You were already dangerous. Having us just gave you a reason to use it for something good. Summer brought prosperity to the Blackwood Ranch. The cattle multiplied. The grass grew thick and green, and their little family grew closer. Mercy learned to ride like she was born to it, and Constance proved to have a gift for managing the ranch's finances. Zeke found himself laughing more than he had in years, and the loneliness that had defined his existence seemed like a distant memory. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Mercy asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. Are we a real family now? She asked. Like, forever and always. Zeke looked at Constance, who smiled and took his hand. What do you think? She asked. I think, Zeke said carefully, that family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to love someone every day, even when it's hard. So we chose each other, Mercy asked. We chose each other, Constance confirmed. Mercy grinned and threw her arms around both of them. Good, she said fiercely, because I ain't ever letting go. As the stars came out over the Montana sky, Zeke reflected on the strange journey that had brought them all together. A year ago, he'd been a man without hope, living in the shadows of his past. Now he had a wife who challenged him to be better, a daughter who filled his days with purpose, and a future that stretched out before them like an unwritten book. It had all started with a desperate little girl's whispered plea. Please marry my mama, mister. She's all I have now. But somewhere along the way, it had become so much more. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were living, loving, building something beautiful from the ashes of their separate tragedies. The winter that followed was harsh, but they weathered it together. Constance gave birth to a son the following spring, a boy they named Thomas, after Mercy's father. The little boy had Zeke's dark hair and Constance's gentle eyes. and he completed their family in a way none of them had expected. Years later, when Mercy was grown and married with children of her own, she would tell the story of how her family came to be. She would speak of a silent rancher who'd shown them kindness when they had nothing, of a mother who'd found her way back from the darkness, and of a love that had grown slowly but surely from the ruins of loss. But that night, as they sat on the porch with the baby sleeping in Constance's arms and Mercy curled up between them, none of them needed to speak. They were home, they were safe, and they were together. In the end, that was all that mattered. The Montana stars shone down on the Blackwood Ranch, witnessing the quiet miracle of 3 broken souls who had found healing in each other's love. And in the years to come, their story would become legend, in those parts the tale of how a desperate child's plea had transformed 3 lives and created a family bound not by blood, but by choice, courage, and an unbreakable love. Now that you've watched the full story, we'd really appreciate it if you could rate it out of 10 in the comments. Your thoughts help us improve and ensure we're bringing you the kind of storytelling you truly enjoy.